So the GH6 has been out for 2 years now, and Lumix with the G9 Mark II has made their stance that they're still continuing to invest in Micro Four Thirds cameras, which is great. But what does that mean for the next GH camera, being the GH7 or the GH6S or Mark II, depending however they want to name that camera? Well, in this conversation and podcast episode with Rhett, we got to talk all about what we hope and predict is going to be in that next Lumix GH7 camera. Now, quick disclaimer, there is no inside information. This is all predictions and guesses at the end of the day, and hopes and dreams and wants for what we want in the GH6 or Mark II or GH7, whatever they're going to name that camera. Now, something else to note, we also officially have a podcast name and an audio format if you want to listen to audio instead. We are on Apple and Spotify and almost anywhere else if you listen to podcasts. So if you want to listen to the Lumix Creators podcast, you can check out the links below in the description to listen to the audio format. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. So today I am joined with none other than Rhett Thompson, which we're going to be talking all things about the GH6, some of the pros, some of the cons, and what we're hoping for the future of the GH6 Mark II or the GH7. So Rhett, without further ado, can you just introduce yourself to my audience, tell them who you are, what you do, and just all that good stuff before we get into the GH6?
Sure, yeah. Like you guys know, Rhett Thompson here. I've been making YouTube videos since 2020 because I was bored. All things Lumix, filmmaking. I do anything video related, from weddings to music videos to short and feature films, usually and mostly shot on the Panasonic Lumix cameras. And yeah, I'm a big fan of the GH6, always have been, and probably always will be. So
I love that. So I think before we even dive into start getting into a whole topic about the GH6 itself, I myself am curious, what made you go down as a Lumix creator myself and creating Lumix content? I'm always curious to hear from other people. What made you go down the road of creating Lumix content on YouTube?
Well, I think it just was a simple matter of, I have Lumix cameras, I want to start doing YouTube videos. It was my original Pro Micro Four Thirds telephoto zoom video, because it was a video that I kept looking for because I wanted one of those lenses, and I couldn't find it. So I figured if I can't find it, I might as well make it, and the rest is kind of history. I started Lumix back in who knows when at this point with the GH4, because Canon wasn't quite doing it for me at the time, and it was either Sony or Panasonic. And I saw a comment that said Sony's great in low light, Panasonic's great for everything else. And that comment kind of, whoever you are, if you remember this out there, please email me, because my life could be totally different if it wasn't for that single comment. So
yeah, I always think back at like my final purchase decision as a 16-year-old back in that day. I was originally deciding to buy the Canon M50 or the Panasonic G7 or the Lumix G7. And I ended up coming to the conclusion, because of the potato jet video, of buying the Lumix G7, because he did a versus video. I'm like, wow, if he never made that video, I would have never, done all of these crazy things with Lumix, become a Lumix content creator and all of these other stuff. So it's like crazy how like YouTube videos, and I think about that too when I'm creating videos, and I bet you do too. It's like how Lumix, like making these YouTube videos, can literally change the trajectory of someone's life, which is kind of crazy to think about.
yeah, that person for me was definitely Griffin Hammond, who was a documentary filmmaker, still putting out great work, doing a lot of political stuff, and he had a lot of great setup videos for the GH4 and GH5. He was a ambassador back in the day and did the launches for all those cameras. So some of his footage and work, like especially on the Sriracha documentary, definitely track that down, everybody. Really inspired me to go with Lumix. So yeah, it's it's a cool thing for sure.
So kind of transitioning a little bit, going into the GH6, when did you end up purchasing that camera? What were some of the initial first impressions of that camera? And then we're going to dive into, for our audience here, just all the pros, advantages, and a couple of cons. But what was your first impressions of the GH6?
It actually took me a while to come around to the camera. I looked at it. I even did a whole episode with Griffin Hammond, actually, on my channel about why we're not quite sure if we needed the upgrade. Do we really need 4K 120 instead of 60? Do we really need 5.7 and 8K over the standard 4K and things like this. But over time, it just sort of made more and more sense to me, and so I ended up picking one up. But yeah, how about you? What was your process getting to the GH6?
Right. Yeah. I think like once the initial launch happened, I forgot how many months after that I ended up buying it, but I kept watching and watching and watching videos trying to see, do I really want to keep into the Micro Four Thirds system since I already had a ton of lenses? And after a while, I ended up convincing myself to purchase one, and then I purchased a second one, and I used them for a long period of time, and I used them for professional work, and I thought they were pretty good, especially coming from the Lumix like ecosystem of manual focus. But I'm pretty sure I bought it right before they announced the S5 II and the S5 IIX with the phase detect autofocus. I think if they announced that, that probably would have changed my decision to purchase the GH6 originally. But at the time, I was like, well, I'm sticking with Lumix because I love Lumix cameras. So I decided to purchase it. And then the formality, and we'll start talking about some of those advantages now, I guess. The formality of that camera and the build of that camera, we're going to be giving each other 5 different reasons on some of the pro advantages, some of the cons, and some of the desired ones in the future. But I'd love to hear what is going to be your first pro advantage for that GH6.
Yeah, well, at this point, I would say just the price and availability. Even new, the prices are very good, and used is kind of insane. The just value of the camera overall is kind of insane, to the point where I see them sometimes. I'm like, do I need a second one? Do I need a third one? I don't know. I'm very much a fan of having a bunch of different cameras that do slightly different things for different situations, but a second one's definitely calling to me. And if you're starting out and you're a filmmaker and you don't need the greatest autofocus in the world, maybe spoilers for a con later. But yeah, I think just the value of the GH6 these days is insane. It's probably some of the most price drops of a camera in recent memory. So
I feel like, so my first pro advantage specifically for the GH6, and I know you commented on my video, but I can't remember it, but is that flippy uppy screen. I'm forever going to call it flippy uppy screen.
yes,
I absolutely love that.
The free angle screen.
The free angle. Well,
but flippy uppy is great too.
Yeah, well, I think the nice part about it, especially, is like if you want your lens and your camera to be perfectly aligned, so it's like when you're looking down at your camera, you can see your monitor and it's not off-centered from where your lens is. Not a huge thing, but like if it's super nitpicky, I absolutely love that flippy uppy screen. And it's also nice to be able to move your HDMI screen and be able to move your screen if you do want it on the side. I know using the S5 IIX and the G9 Mark II, the moment you plug in an SSD to record external SSD or power options, or even if you have an HDMI, you can't flip that screen sideways on your monitor, kind of making it a little bit useless in my opinion. So it's one of those big advantages, and I think that's like one of my favorite things about the GH6. What's your second one?
You know, I guess to go off of that and riff a little bit, I tried to be a little bit more broad, and I tried to also make things that are specifically pros to the GH6, since other cameras can do similar things. But I had just the body design in general. I love the fan to keep things cool. I love the flippy, tilty, free angle, whatever people call it, screen. Stuff like the front record button and the tally lights. So just the body is the most usable and like straightforward to use and solid feeling camera body that I think I've probably used. I mean, I've used the S1H, which is just like an even bigger version. So maybe that one is kind of the king of like tanky Lumix cameras. But yeah, I just put the body design in general. There's really not much I would change. Like even the cons people mention, I've never ran into those personally. Like, oh, I hit the back dial by accident. That doesn't really happen to me.
That's funny. I hit the back dial all the time.
Yeah, see, people say that, but I'm like, I don't know, maybe I just have like the perfect hand shape to just never hit that dial. And because I've given the camera to second shooters and people like that on a web series or at a wedding, and they've hit it, so I know it's a thing, but personally never happened to me, no.
That's funny. Well, I'm going to have you giving me your second, third, and fourth reason because you just took basically all my reasons in that one little sentence. Internal fan with no overheating issues, that front record button, those tally lights, all
My bad,
great
my bad.
things. But that's totally okay. Totally okay. I specifically told Rhett before this podcast to give you guys insight. Like I told him, I'm not going to tell you what mine are. I don't want you to tell me what yours are. And just to see what are the really things that creators themselves like. So give me your second and third reason. What are those? And I'll riff off them too.
Technically that was the first and second, the price and the body design. So I'll go into the third one, and the second one was just like the color science and the image. I feel like the warm tones, especially with skin, come out a lot in the GH6 specifically, whereas the GH5 kind of had a little bit more of the green. The GH5S kind of corrected to magenta. The S5 and the S5 II kind of has very neutral, which is still a good thing, but if I just slap on a nicest LUT or something like that to the GH6, it just feels nice and pleasant, even if it's not maybe that accurate. So I just love the color and the image. It feels very organic to me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I feel like the color, and it is interesting because I don't believe you shot on the G9 Mark II yet, correct?
No, not yet.
Yeah, well, that color science, and it's probably because it's a phase detect sensor, just like the Lumix S5 2X, those colors are basically identical. And it's probably a whole new color science of Vlog than the GH6, which I bet they made a whole new color science specifically for the GH6. And then once they're like, all right, we have phase detect now in our autofocus and we have these newer sensors, that color science just had to change instantly. So they just made a specific color science just for the GH6, which the GH6 is really pleasing like colors come out of it, especially when you use that Dangyou teal and orange, classic teal and orange LUT for Vlog. It looks even better. But
I'm sure that LUT is on me right now, so I guess I'll let everybody out there be the judge. So
it probably, if I'm color grading this, yeah, it probably is. So if you're listening to the audio version, which if you don't know, there is an audio version on Apple, Spotify, and if you listen to audio podcasts anywhere else, it might be there too. But Lumix Creators Podcast, if you're interested in listening to the audio version anytime, you can listen to that. But okay, so color science. Yeah, I love the color of Lumix. I feel like Vlog is one of the best color profiles. So what's that fourth reason for yourself?
So I just realized that the fourth reason is thermal management. So I guess that kind of counts with the fan. So we'll just pretend like I didn't say the fan earlier. So yeah, just I guess I'll do reliability. It's got the fan, it's got the incredible weather sealing and freeze proofing, and it just goes forever. It's got dual card slots. It just has never given me an issue and will never stop as long as you give it power and give it memory cards, and that's a very important thing for me.
And I'm gonna piggyback on you because this was technically my fifth reason after you took reason 1, 2, 3, and 4. But it's actually recording internal Apple ProRes, so that's currently not really possible without doing an external SSD for the S5 2X and the G9 Mark II, but it is possible on the GH6, which is really ideal if you do need to record Apple ProRes, which are massive files besides the point. But if you need to record to a CF Express Type B card, or you want to record those higher bitrate options and you don't want to get a crazy expensive SD card, or you need the weather sealant of this camera, like if you're in a dust, if you're in the desert, rain, snow, any of those crazy environments, it is nice being able to have a bigger form factor of a memory card going into the camera, which I feel like is a huge advantage for the GH6, especially if you need any type of weather sealant. What's your last reasoning? Or you could riff on that as well if you want.
Well, it's actually going to be both, because how the turntables, you've taken kind of my last one in a bit of a way. There's a slightly different spin on it, but that's just the variety of frame rates, resolutions, codecs, record times, different media. You can still use your SD cards, or you can update to the CF Express cards, which I do recommend. I get why people don't like it, but I actually have embraced it and really do enjoy it at this point. But it's great to me that you can record the lowest 24 megabits per second like codec, you can record 22 hours on like a 512 gigabyte SD card, or you can go all the way up to like maxed out ProRes internal and get about like 15 minutes instead of 15 hours. So it's just the absolute incredible range of shooting styles and resolutions and frame rates, and no crops on any of them except for one, which again maybe we'll talk about later. But just the range of things you can do, including that internal ProRes, which is rare for any camera, let alone any Lumix camera. So I think just, yeah, that was my last one, is just you can shoot it in any way possible, because you know, a lot of cameras only have very middle end kind of bit rates and codecs and resolutions, and they neglect the low end, and they don't have the high end stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And it's also interesting. It's like, it's really hard to find an actual 8-bit option if you, for whatever reason, want to record 8-bit in this camera, which is kind of cool and speaks to Lumix themselves. So we're going to kind of dive into the cons. I'm going to take this first one because it's probably both on our list. Potentially. Maybe you decided not to, but I was going to say the lack of phase detect autofocus. And I mentioned this in some other conversations, but I really just feel like Lumix has already stated, you know, in some of the Japan videos from other creators when they got to go there, like they've stated that like they've been working on phase detect for a while. They've just been trying to perfect it in a sense and try to make it as good as possible with the first launch. So it feels like the Micro Four Third phase detect was coming. It's just, I feel like as a community, we try to push way too hard for that camera.
Yeah, I did put autofocus down on the list. I think the GH6 autofocus is the most usable contrast and, you know, DFD phase detect ever was, and ever obviously will be. It still has all the same issues, just a little bit less, you know. So it wasn't game changing, and you know, I always put it this way: it is a huge bummer in a lot of ways, but some camera had to be the last camera with contrast-based autofocus, and it's just a bummer that the GH6 just happened to be that camera. I still think it's great, but yeah, I understand everybody's feelings towards it and what you're saying for sure.
I don't think the autofocus was necessarily bad if you were in, you know, B-roll settings or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it was more or less like if you were in an interview setting or if you were a content creator, the biggest issue really came down to was the pulsing issues that it still had because of contrast space, where it'd go back and forth of the autofocus and the lights in the background would just be horrendously pulsing. I was making my video about the GH6 after 2 years. I was just like totally forgot how bad pulsing used to be in my videos and on the camera, and I was like, wow, that is crazy. But like still to this day, I use the GH6 for a B cam interview when I just throw it all in manual focus or I put a cinema lens on it, and it still works great as a B cam or as a B-roll camera. But I'd love to hear what's that, if autofocus was one of your cons, what's that second con for yourself?
Okay, this one's a little niche and a little controversial, and I've talked about it a lot, so I figured I should kind of get the unfiltered opinion on it. But I put down the streaking issue that a lot of people ran into, just to address this for maybe the final time until my long-term GH6 video comes out. You know, as minor or major or as few or as many times as people ran into the issue, I think more than the actual issue is kind of like the psychological effect of just being worried about the issue. I think that's worse than the issue itself. I've had it maybe a dozen times or more in the years I've used the camera. And of those times, I've been able to minimize or eliminate it at least half of those times again. But there has been times where it just out of nowhere, completely unexpected, like a bright stage, no real darkness, and I would look and just like off of like a yellow shirt or just be streaking. And that was one of the few times where it was like I didn't notice it, I couldn't reduce it, and afterwards it was like one of the few times where I was like, this really shouldn't have happened. So I have to clear the air on that. It's real, it exists. I think it's not a huge deal, but if you're worried about it at all, I can certainly see it being a deal breaker depending on what type of work you do.
Yeah, actually, that was one of my things as well, and that's interesting. That's super, like you said, it's more specific, and I would actually almost agree more to your point. I would be worried after the first time it came up for a client project. Luckily, the client wasn't there. They just sent me the products and like filming that type of stuff.
Mm.
But after it happened, it was more or less like now I'm having to like work around my camera instead of my camera being a tool and being a part of an extension of myself to create whatever I need to create. And it was more of like, man, now I have to figure out how can I change this lighting? What do I have to do with this entire setup after I already set up all the lights, after I did all of that? But then, yeah, like you said, I really like doing a lot of backlight. Like when in a lot of my commercials, I do tons of hard backlight because the glow over someone looks just absolutely stunning sometimes. But I was always worried, like on the GH6, like, is this about to just have terrible streaking issues and I'm not going to be able to get the shot I purely desire? Which it is a bummer that that was an actual issue and there was no real firmware update, I feel like, that fixed it necessarily. Maybe had minor improvements, but it's like one of those things where it's like, that's definitely a bummer. I'm gonna hit you with my next one, and then we'll see what yours is. Dual SD card slot. So it was nice that it has the CF Express Type B card, which was one of my pro advantages. However,
Yep.
not everyone has a CF Express Type B card. They can be pretty expensive in comparison to buying an SSD. I wish that there was more of a dual card slot system where it had like you could put either an SD card and a CF Express Type B card. So it's like you could put both of those or one or the other. I wish there was some system like that, and that again we'll get into that. Maybe that's a hope for the future. But yeah, what about you? What about you?
Yeah, I did put it down as well. Even though I'm fully sold on it, at the beginning I wasn't, and for certain types of shooters, it's going to be complete overkill. And even if you fully embrace and adapt the CF Express and you love it for the ProRes and all that sort of thing, you still only get one. So in my mind, when you're shooting ProRes, it's potentially going to be a bigger scale project or really great footage or, you know, a variety of different things. But then you can't record a backup with the second card slot because the SD card isn't fast enough. So I guess like it's just a little weird, you know.
I was about to ask for yourself, have you ever shot a wedding on the GH6? And I know as a wedding shooter,
Yeah.
a lot of people like having those dual cards being like simultaneously recording on the both cards at the same time. Have you ran into that issue?
With the CF Express?
Like wanting to record simultaneously at the exact same time for like a wedding, for example.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I do shoot, you know, backed up to the, you know, I have a SanDisk 128 CF Express and an Angelbird 512. I will say, okay, so when I was shooting on the GH5, anybody shot on that camera would realize that the SD cards had to be so specific to actually enable the dual recording, because if they were different sizes or different manufacturers, sometimes they would be the exact same card bought at a different time and it would not want to do that. I've done stuff where I've put in my Angelbird and a SanDisk as a backup. They like a 512 Angelbird and like a 256 SanDisk SD card, and they've still let me dual record. So the dual recording is actually kind of even better and more flexible with the GH6 if you can, you know, get a CF Express card and get a CF Express card reader, which costs like not an insignificant amount of money. So it's a mixed bag at best for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag for sure. What's your next con if you got one?
I would just say the size. I would say, as much as I love the body design, it is a very kind of untravel friendly camera. When you want to take it on a trip, I find just the form factor and how like professional it looks. Like the original S5, some of these other cameras look fine, and I don't know. I just, something about it always was like just a little hard to balance on a gimbal, just a little too big for travel. Some of the smaller Micro Four Thirds lenses look a little goofy on it, you know, which is not that important. But yeah, just the size. It's the largest, you know, Micro Four Thirds camera, even with the G9 II coming out. I like the size, but just like the CF Express, it's a mixed bag for me.
Yeah, I've heard that opinion a lot. So my next one actually, which is funny because I feel like all my next ones are improvements in what they did on the G9 Mark II, which I'm like, that really should have just been the GH6, but
Yeah.
was the lack of stabilization improvements. Now, it definitely had improvements on the stabilization, but what the G9 Mark II got, I just did a clip in the video and I was so shocked. I was literally running with the G9 Mark II with the high electronic stabilization on, and it looked pretty decent.
Yeah.
And then I just did some image stabilization in post, and afterwards that camera almost looked like it was on a gimbal at that point. Which
Right.
my hot take on that is like the G9 Mark II is like in the beginning stages of the stabilization from GoPro, which I
Yeah.
think is like really cool to see. And I feel like going forward, and we'll talk about that pretty soon, it might end up becoming an absolute just straight up a gimbal in a Micro Four Third camera. So you got any more cons on this list?
Okay, so this one might be a bit of a rant, and I want to get you in on this too. So I'll just go on a bit of a rant. I'll try to keep it vague with a few specific things. But I guess it would just be the small bugs and errors and even stuff I would call like regressions maybe that was in the GH6 always felt frustrating to me. So like I love OpenGate as you yourself do. But you know, and I was super happy we got a OpenGate 60p at 10-bit because in the GH5 Mark II, GH5, we had 4K 60 in 4:3, but it was 8-bit, which makes me not want to use it as much, especially for vlog. So when I found out I had 4K 60, or I think it's 4.4K 60 in the GH6, I was super excited. But then there's a significant crop, which, you know, it feels like one step forward, one step back. So other little things like the HDMI mirroring, which was always enabled on previous cameras, now doesn't work. There's like things like live view composite, which is a photo feature, but like the GH5 II had it, the G9 II had it, even the G100 has it, and it's still not in the GH6. And just little things like that, where I felt, or like the live cropping for like reframing your shot digitally in camera. I could go on, but it felt like they put so much new stuff in it. It felt a little sad that some of these older features started to go missing that a lot of people really loved.
Yeah, I was definitely bummed seeing that really the 4.4K 4:3 60 frames a second, the anamorphic mode was
Mm-hmm.
not actually open gate myself. I was like, dang, this is like minus the autofocus. If say it had phase detect autofocus, but if it didn't have, you know, that 4K 6 or that 60 frames a second open gate setting, that's the perfect, hands down perfect content creator social media camera that has
Yeah.
open gate, that has 60 frames a second. And it's definitely a bummer. It's like you said, like the HDMI issue, being able to not like see all your info on your monitor, on your camera, and on your external monitor is also like, why can't this? I think it's going to be a firmware update. That's the reality of this. By the time this is recording, if you're listening to this, you know, months later or years later, it might already be fixed and you might have never known that that was an issue. There's definitely a lot of like small little things like that you mentioned.
Yeah, none of it's huge, but it adds up to be like, I don't know. It's a weird sense. And even like really niche stuff. Like I used to use the Zhiyun gimbals all the time, and I would, you know, use an electronic focus if I wanted to do manual focus, connected right to the fly-by-wire, which is great that it works with Panasonic cameras. But GH5 II onward, it overrides the like punch in. So every time you touch that focus wheel, even when recording now, it like punches in your image with the like live view focus check, even if it's set to off in the camera. And Panasonic says it's Zhiyun's fault. Zhiyun says it's Panasonic's fault. I don't want to speculate, but yeah, it feels like they had working systems for some of this stuff, and when they started these new generations of cameras, some of that stuff changed, and it was either a slight learning curve to get used to, or things that I think they should be able to fix, and probably will fix knowing Panasonic, but we got to keep on them a little bit too, so just a friendly reminder.
Right. It's definitely, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, that would be nice. I know it's like, I guess my last thing is like, I would love if they put on some of those features that, the other cameras have been getting. The real-time LUT, when that came out on the S5 II, I was like, oh, that'd be great if that came out on the GH6. After using it for a while, it's really only useful in photo modes for myself because I like color grading, but I can understand the benefits if someone wants vlog. But I feel like you're basically just using a different natural color profile at that point when you use real-time LUT baked in. So, do you have any other cons that you have for the GH6?
I mean, you could talk about things all day, like the battery life and things like that, but generally, I mean, as you guys might have noticed from the last one, I was getting into some pretty nitpicky territory. It was actually pretty hard for me to find these cons with the camera. So yeah, that's it for me. I could talk all day about the pros and the cons, but I'm happy now. Any last little nitpicks or rants you want to go on?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything. Yeah, I don't feel like I really have anything to add specifically about like any cons for this camera. Like you said, you could talk about the battery life, and I don't know if I'm the only person out there. I burned through the Lumix batteries within like 30 minutes a pop. Granted, I do have a monitor. There is a remote like record button plugged into the camera. I am
Yeah,
recording like 6K most of the time. I'm recording the high quality camera bits, and I never turn off my camera. If I set it down, I just set it down and leave. So I always power all my cameras with V mounts. So I
same.
never really see it as a con having bad battery life because I just power with a V mount anyways. But now after talking about, where the GH6, some of the great things about it, which I still think GH6 is a solid camera to purchase, especially on that used market, or if you're looking for a B cam or you don't want to spend the price point for a G9 Mark II or the S5 II or S5 IIX, it's still a great budget cinema camera. Like when I was originally purchased the G9, what I purchased for the G9 back in the day, I could buy the GH6 for basically the exact same price, which is kind of insane to think about. I bought the original G9, which didn't even have 4K 60 10-bit, only 4K 60 8-bit with a 10-minute recording limit for around like $1,000. And now you can get the GH6, which is just an absolutely insanely beast of a camera. It's definitely a worthwhile camera if you're interested. Do you have any thoughts about that before we dive right into the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I always try to communicate to people is like, and hopefully I can make some more videos on this soon about just having two G9s or two S5 IIs feels like a waste to me because just, doing a single autofocus, putting it on a tripod for a B cam or C cam, unless you're really just rolling in money or don't want to do any color matching in post, having a GH6 or a GH5S or a number of other cameras as a B or a C camera to do different things makes a lot of sense if you can't afford, the $1,800 or $2,000 for some of the newest cameras. So, yeah, I can see a lot of people using this for a bunch of A cameras if they need like 3, 4, 5 camera setups, or using this as a great B camera for some of the new phase detect stuff.
Again, transitioning sort of now future forward looking. I personally, every time I talk to any of the Lumix creators, almost everyone has, what their wants are for the full frame camera, because that's kind of easy to say what they want. What do you want, Rhett, with the GH6 Mark II or the GH7, whichever we want to call this? What do you want in that camera going forward in the future? What are some of your hopes, your desires? What do you want to see with Micro Four Third, the sort of cinema line, the GH line in the future?
So I'm gonna kind of do a 2-for-1 kind of thing here, which is I think I'm stealing this idea from Sebastian at Red Frame Tech, who mentioned it I think in one of his videos. But I think more options for recording and powering and things like that is the future for all cameras, and I don't think the GH7 or whatever it's called should be left behind. So, I think a dual CF Express card would be great. If they can fit a dual CF and dual SD combined, like I think some of Sony's cameras do that, that would be great. But even if they just say, you know what, deal with it, it's 2 CF Express Type Bs. If you own a GH6, you're probably in that camp already. So I think it's just time to bite the bullet and either go full send or go even further and just include both types of ports, as well as maybe like a dual USB-C. Like I think Sebastian said the Z8 has that, and I know you probably see people all the time asking, can I use power delivery and SSD at the same time? And right now you can't.
Right. Yeah, no, so that was actually one of my points as well, is the dual SD / CF Express Type B card slots, which also, that's a great point. Dual SSD, or not dual SSD, having 2 USBs, one for power and one for external recording, would be really, really nice. Now, one point I did pit on this is the face detect autofocus, but I feel like that's just a no-brainer. It's like, duh, that's obviously going to be in the camera. The second
if it
thing
wasn't, it would be wild.
Oh my goodness. If it was not in the camera, goodness gracious, I don't know what I would do. I would be just like, well, I guess I'm not buying that camera if it doesn't have face detect. I also would say a similar body style as well. I love the body style, even though it is still that bigger style. I still think it's super uniquely designed, and it would be cool if they made an X version that's more, say you cut off the viewfinder and it's more just a video first camera. Maybe it's a little bit bulkier, but like just something that's more cinema line, sort of like, for example, in a future video that will be coming to this channel soon, talking about my future wants with the future full frame camera, but it's just the normal line and then the X line, but that X line is like that FX3 or the FX30 style body, where it's more of a cinema camera. There's more mounting points on the camera, and then maybe it is a little bit bigger to add 2 USB-C ports, maybe a mini XLR port. But that's my next thing.
I'd love an SSD, man. I would love an SSD and some more pro. I think, I have more pro features and inputs and things like, so SDI, just to have, latency-free kind of image transmission and like monitoring and things like that. The XLR stuff. I definitely think, a GH7 kind of being like a weird Frankenstein of like Black Magic cameras and Sony FX cameras, and while still retaining what was great about the GH6, I think might be a great kind of style to go after, because the Panasonic broadcasting division doesn't really do much anymore, and I believe has actually been folded into Lumix. So hopefully the broadcast people can start bringing out some really interesting stuff in the future.
Yeah, it would be cool to see like a eventually updated, BGH1 or BGH2 camera. Like those box style cameras haven't been updated in a long time. So I guess I'll just go with my next one, which this is, I've been shouting at the rooftop, I feel like, towards Lumix about this, is the 5.8K open gate, 60 frames a second, 420 10-bit. Like that, once they have open gate 60 frames a second, that will probably end up, whatever camera that is, Micro Four Third, if it's full frame, will probably definitely be full frame. That would be like my go-to workhorse camera. Shooting 60 frames a second in the 3x2 or a 4x3 format is absolutely, I feel like, a must as a content creator, or even a filmmakers nowadays who have clients with multiple different deliverables,
Yeah, I had that one down as well. I don't even care if it's 5.8K or 5.9K or whatever. If they somehow even managed full frame, no crop, 4K, line skip it. It doesn't even have to be the best quality because it's still going to be pretty darn good. But if it's a slight, you know, bit rate, if it's 420 instead of 422, whatever it is,
Right.
if there's a minor sacrifice, as long as we get the full sensor coverage, 60 frames a second, that's really the biggest thing for me. So whatever they can do, I'm sure that's going to be in the upgrade, and I think that would be huge if they could do it.
Hit me with that next desired want you for the GH6 Mark II or GH7.
It's we're going to end on a bang here, but it's surprise, just going to be those small bug fixes and updates. I want them to put back in all the stuff that was in the old cameras. I want them to really iron out all those tiny little things because this with all these things fixed that we've been talking about and upgrades, I think the GH7 could be nearly a perfect camera because while the full frame stuff has the edge in image quality and low light, a lot of the rolling shutter and frame rates I think is always going to be easier to do on a smaller sensor, and so I think having those two avenues is really going to be great. So yeah, the bug fixes and of course updates to all the major specs. So maybe we bump up the resolutions, the frame rates, all the expected stuff.
I'm gonna hit you on my last one as
Go for it.
a more of a boldish actually request. And
Ooh.
this is the ability, and this is actually literally a YouTube comment I saw as we were planning out for this video. I was like, that would be sick. Is being
Stealing
able
YouTube
to
comments.
record. I know it's great, especially with the Nikon buying red and all of that happening and the questionable lawsuit stuff and all that. Being able to record most likely Apple ProRes RAW via SSD, straight in camera, being able to record RAW, and maybe that's the stab that I don't think there's gonna be a way to do compressed RAW with a low quality RAW. It's gonna have to probably be a high quality RAW, which will probably be absolutely ridiculous in how much space it would take up. But being able to have some type of format of RAW inside the camera would be great, and not to have it to require external RAW, because I know sometimes there's HDMI lag issues and different things like that. So being able to record RAW to an SSD.
Hey, yeah, I think that would be pretty great. Honestly, at this point, any kind of RAW would be great. I wonder. I don't know if because Nikon bought Red, that means it's open game, or if that just means Nikon's going to be suing people even harder because they have more money to do it
Yeah.
with. So, um, it's a very strange time to be around for that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's
Right.
always been great that Lumix can do Blackmagic RAW and Apple ProRes RAW, depending on what your needs are. And so
Right.
taking that to the next level would be really interesting for certain projects.
Yeah, it would be great. And again, I don't know any of the legal logistics, but to have some type of compressed raw internal to these next cameras would be an absolute game changer for the camera industry as a whole. I know for myself, not personally on like these YouTube videos, but on client sets and stuff like that, being able to have the ability to manually adjust my white balance, manually adjust my ISO, my tints and different things like that is actually a real big game changer, especially if for whatever reason you used the wrong white balance settings, you used the wrong ISO settings, whatever you did. It's absolutely be huge to be able to go into post, correct all of that, and then have it look exactly the way you want. I know personally, every time I record, I make sure my white balance settings, my color adjustment and tints are perfect to what I think looks good based on what I'm looking in my camera monitor. But sometimes, as humans, we make mistakes. So RAW would be a great feature. So, Rhett, do you have anything else you want to end on talking about the GH6, the future of the GH6, and also just share your channel? Tell the people where they can find you as well.
Well, I'm just saying we might see Blackmagic RAW at some point because they are in the L Mount Alliance. So if Panasonic and Blackmagic start working together a little bit more, I think that could be
Yeah.
huge. you know, I also am excited for whatever new game-changing feature the next line of GH cameras brings, because with every generation of GH, there's been a borderline, if not actually game-changing feature that has set the pace for the whole industry. And
Yep.
we've never wanted it until we got it. And so I love that they're using Micro Four Thirds as a sort of playground to try out these new things like dynamic range boost and IBIS and things like that in the past. So I think the thing we most will want to see, we probably don't even know what it is yet.
Yeah. You're probably right. Anyways,
Well,
Rhett, where can people find you?
yep, I'm Rhett Thompson. You can search me up on YouTube, do tons of Lumix content, as I said before, and you know, hopefully doing more with the newer cameras, the G9 II, the S5 II, and you know, hopefully being featured on Matthew's channel more often in the future, or vice versa. So yeah, come on, check out some videos. There's some good stuff there, I think.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thank you so much, Rhett, for joining me on this episode. Yeah, thanks, man.
Yep, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So thank you so much for Rhett for joining me today and talking all about what we hope for the next GH7 or GH6 Mark II camera. Now I'd be curious to hear your guys' comments to see what you guys want in the next GH6 Mark II or GH7 style camera. What are some of those specs? What are some of those features? What are some hopes and dreams? Let me know in those comments below. Now if you want to see me talk all about the GH6 versus the G9 Mark II, check out that video right here. YouTube recommends you might like this video right here. And until the next one, peace.